Good day and welcome to the SSRC Family Structure, Stability, and Child Wellbeing webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Chris Moore, Senior Scholar at Child Trends. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And welcome everyone. This is the 5th Emerging Scholar webinar. And today's topic is Family Structure, Stability, and how it relates to child well-being by Terry and Craigie. Going to start with a very brief overview of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. It is a virtual library that will contain over 2,500 items. It's important to note that it's designed for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, so it's not just for researchers, but for everyone who's interested in self-sufficiency. It includes a number of interactive features, events and conferences, and please feel free to post events related to self-sufficiency that you want others to know about. The Make a Linkage tab contains a directory of organizations and stakeholders in the field, for example, foundations, nonprofits, public agencies, and it can be browsed and filtered by audience type and topical area. Organizations can register themselves with the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, and they will be sent the SSRC badge or logo to be featured on their website. It's not an endorsement, but rather another way to promote professional connection and conversation. And the My SSRC, third, will go live in January, and it will allow users to set up their own SSRC section on the website. And then fourth, there are data sets and data sources, and so if someone is interested in doing original research or knowing about a database, there is a large number of them on the website. As you know, the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse covers 12 topical areas. They're shown here. It's a very broad set and could be absolutely overwhelming, except that it includes resources that are relevant to self-sufficiency. For example, the first one, asset building, could be all about Wall Street, but on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, it relates to self-sufficiency issues. The last emerging scholar, in fact, Dr. Ruby Mendenhall, gave a talk on how low-income families build assets, and that's the kind of work that we put on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. Emerging scholars are selected, chosen on a number of criteria. They're either in graduate school or they hold a graduate degree, early career, usually 1 to 5 years of experience, no more than 10 years, but doing research on self-sufficiency issues that are related to the 12 topic areas we just looked at. They're conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue. And they're currently working in an academic setting, a program, a think tank, or an agency setting. And we want to ask, by the way, for nominations of emerging scholars, and they don't have to be academic researchers. People who are doing research in an agency setting would be most welcome. Today's emerging scholar is Terry Ann Craigie. She's an assistant professor of economics at Connecticut College, has a PhD in economics from Michigan State. Her interests include labor economics, the economics of the family, applied microeconomics, child support and complex family issues, and you'll note that some of her recent work is highlighted, and it is all on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. So I want to encourage people to ask a question. Participants on this webinar can submit questions throughout the webinar through the question and answer feature, which is on the bottom right side of your screen. And these questions will be collected and answered after Dr. Craigie has her presentation. And if you have comments, those are welcome as well. If we run out of time, questions will be answered and the answers will be posted on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, along with other webinar materials after the event. So at that point, I will turn over to Dr. Craigie.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar on family structure, stability, and child well-being. So just to introduce the topic here, for much of the nation's history, most American children were born into and spent their childhood in traditional married couple families. But by the 20th century, a growing share of children experienced a breakup in families and spent at least some portion of their childhood living with just one biological parent. The non-marital family structure, as well as family breakdown are growing in the United States, and these are especially characteristic in low-income population. Given the significant change in America's family landscape, the well-being of children is bound to be influenced, and as such should be thoroughly studied. Prior research confirms that traditional families with two married parents tend to yield the best outcome for children. This includes measures of cognitive development represented by academic test scores, health such as birth weight, asthma, and obesity, as well as socio-emotional development such as aggressive and violent tendencies, anxiety, and depression. A critical question we need to ask, however, is the degree to which the stability of the family setting affects how children fare. In fact, recent research holds that it is in large part the stability of the traditional family structure that gives it its advantage. So then, are children affected by the family structure into which they were born, or is it the stability of the family structure that really matters? So here we see U.S. trends in family structure from 1950 to 2011. And over this period, marriage among women have actually declined significantly. In 1950, marriage rates exceeded 65%, but by 2011, this has declined by over 20%. Now, in addition, when we look at the never married demographic, this has increased by nearly 40% over this period, while divorce rates have nearly quadrupled. Now, with this in mind, the goals of this presentation are as follows: to identify the main types of family structure and their effects on early childhood outcomes related to cognition, health, and socio-emotional development. We need to explore the significance of family instability as well as the pathways through which early child well-being is influenced. And for the purposes of this presentation, one important policy response to the changing family landscape will be explored, and that is child support. So let's start off by looking at the effects of family structure on child developmental outcomes. So based on what the previous literature has done, we know that marriage seems to yield positive effects on early childhood development. Previous findings indicate that child cognitive test scores, health, and socio-emotional developmental outcomes are relatively better than those of children who are born to unwed parents. Now for this presentation, I'm going to show some actual evidence on this. I will use data from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study to conduct some analyses. It's important to understand that the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study is an urban data set that follows a cohort of approximately 5,000 children called focal children born between 1998 and 2000. Of these children, about 2/3 of them, or 3,700, were born to unwed parents, unwed moms. The Fragile Family Study provides comprehensive detail on the characteristics of both parents and the nature of their relationship at the time of the focal child's birth and throughout the child's life course. Now, in addition to this, the Fragile Families contains extensive information on early child developmental outcomes given through in-home assessments conducted at ages 3, 5, and 9 years old. But for the purpose of these analyses, we'll focus on the outcomes of 5-year-old children. So we're looking at the in-home assessments at 5 years old. Okay, so how will we classify family structure? Well, we will focus on family structure at the time of the focal child's birth. Basically, what's going on at the time of the child's birth is either that parents are married or unmarried. For those children who are born to married parents, we can categorize these or classify these as marital families. But for non-marital families, we can have two types. We can consider a case in which parents are unmarried but living together at the time of the child's birth, so we can classify this as a cohabiting family. But a single-parent family would be the case where the mother is neither married nor cohabiting with anyone at the time of the child's birth. Okay, so to measure child well-being, we will look at the three main areas: cognitive development, health, and socio-emotional development, and we'll use one measure for each of these categories. So for cognitive development, we'll look at the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, revised, which is administered to children at age 3 or older. This is a measure of receptive vocabulary capabilities for standard English, as well as a measure of academic readiness for kids. For health, we will be using a yes or no indicator for obesity, and this information is derived from the in-home assessment. So the interviewer records physical measurements for the child's height and weight, and we use this to determine whether the child is obese or not. And finally, when we think about socio-emotional development, there are several factors or several different outcomes that you can consider. But for these analyses, we'll focus on aggressive behaviors. The questions are given to the primary caregiver during the in-home assessment, and these questions are taken from the child behavior checklist that are directly related or characterize aggressive behaviors. These questions are then used to create an index ranging from 0 to 36, representing, with 36 actually representing the most severe level of aggression. And once again, these measures are all taken or assessed at age 5. Okay, so here are the first set of results related to cognitive development. And once again, we're looking at the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test Revised, which is a measure of receptive vocabulary capabilities for standard English and may be used as a measure of academic readiness as well. And we're seeing the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test scores for children born to married parents, cohabiting parents, and single parents. Those children born to married parents, however, they have the highest test scores compared to the other two. So we see that there's about an 8-point advantage over those children born to cohabiting parents and nearly a 9-point advantage compared to those children who are born to single mothers. Now for obesity, we see that there is a marriage advantage as well. Those children born to married parents actually show the lowest incidence of obesity compared to those children born to cohabiting and single parents. In fact, those children, there are about 13% of children born to married parents who are obese compared to 18% born to cohabiting and single parents. And finally, we're looking at the aggressiveness index here, and we do see that children born to married parents display the fewest aggressiveness or aggressive behaviors or aggressive tendencies compared to those children born to cohabiting and single parents. In fact, those children born to single mothers display the most aggressive behaviors, while those children born to married parents actually display the fewest aggressive tendencies. So in summary, therefore, we see that marriage does confer significant benefits for child well-being. These children born to married parents have the highest test scores, the lowest incidence of obesity, and display the fewest aggressive behaviors. Nonetheless, I think it's important to try to figure out here if this is really a family structure effect or a stability effect. Certainly marriages are more stable than those other family structures related to cohabiting families and a single parent family. So what we're observing may actually be a stability effect. So in this section of the presentation, we'll explore whether and to what extent the stability of the family structure may influence these outcomes. Now, what's been done in the literature already? Well, pretty much the literature has shown that family instability does seem to have negative consequences for kids. The studies have recorded negative consequences for cognitive scores as well as various socio-emotional outcomes. Not much has been found or reported for different measures of child health. Now, to classify family instability, we can look at stable and unstable households or families based on the family structure into which the child was born. So then we'll have 3 different stable family structures and 3 different unstable family structures. Now, for the stable family structures, once again, this starts at the family structure at birth, and we see whether or not that family structure has remained throughout the child's life course or it has somehow changed. So for the stable single-parent family structure, this would be the case where the child is born to a single mother who is not married or cohabiting with anyone, but she has somehow partnered with, she has not partnered with anybody since the time of the child's birth. So the child is born to a single mother, and she has remained single throughout the child's life course. Now, for the stable cohabiting family, this occurs where the child is born to an unwed couple who are living together, and they've remained or stayed together throughout the child's life course. And finally, those children who are in stable marital households, this occurs where a child is born to married parents, and these parents have remained married throughout the child's life course. Now, on the other hand, when we think about the unstable family structures, we look again at what's going on at the time of birth. So we could be looking at a single, cohabiting, or marital family, and some change may have occurred throughout the child's life. So for the unstable single-parent household or single-parent family, this would be the case where the child is born to a single mother who has since repartnered or remarried someone. When we look at the unstable cohabiting family, this is the case where a child is born to cohabiting parents who have split up at some point after birth. And finally, the unstable marital family would be the case where the child is born to married parents who have gotten divorced. Now, to measure child well-being, we'll use the same measures as we did with the family structure analyses. To measure cognitive development, we'll use the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test revised. For health, we'll use the simple yes-no indicator for obesity. And for socio-emotional development, we'll use an index for aggressive behaviors, which once again increases with the level or severity of aggressiveness that the child displays. So here are the first set of results for the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test revised. And here we're seeing, we're classifying the stability or instability of the family structure based on the family structure into which the child was born. So before, when we did the family structure analyses, we looked at marital households, cohabiting households, and single-parent households. But here we're looking at these cognitive scores based on whether these outcomes or these structures at the time the child was born can be classified as stable or unstable. Now, based on these results, what we see here is that children who are living with stably married parents, now that is a case where the child is born to married parents and they remained married throughout the child's life course. These kids tend to have the highest scores compared to every other family structure. When we look at or compare the cognitive scores to children who have experienced divorce, we see that it's quite dramatic. We see that there's about an 8-point difference when we compare children in stably marital families compared to those kids who have experienced divorce. We also see that there's at least a 10-point advantage compared to any other family structure, for whether it's cohabiting or single, and whether it's even stable or unstable. Now, when we look at obesity as well, we see that instability of the family structure does tend to increase the incidence of obesity for marital and cohabiting families. Those children who are living in stable marital households, they have the lowest incidence of obesity, whereas those children who have experienced divorce, they actually have the highest. So those children who have experienced divorce are twice as likely to be obese compared to those children in stable marital families. Now, when we look at cohabiting families as well, when there is a family breakdown in this particular family unit, we see that does increase the incidence of obesity. But when we observe single-parent families, any instability that occurs, what we actually see here is a slight decline, which indicates that when a social father enters the household, this actually helps to reduce obesity somewhat. Finally, when we look at aggressiveness, yes, there is a marital advantage here, a marriage advantage here, but this is for the stable marital family. Those children in stable marital families actually display the fewest aggressive tendencies compared to any other family structure. And if they experience divorce, or if these children born to married parents experience divorce, that actually increases their aggressiveness. We see a similar increase when we observe cohabiting families. Whenever there's a family breakdown, that increases their aggressive tendencies. But for the single-parent family, if a social father or a stepfather enters the household, this actually does not increase the aggressiveness that children display. So in summary, therefore, we see that, yes, there is a marriage advantage, but when we consider the stability or the stability question, it is really the stability of the marriage that confers these benefits. It improves cognitive health and socio-emotional outcomes, as we've seen before. Now, when the child experiences breakdown in the marital or cohabiting family, this does tend to lower test scores. It increases the incidence of obesity as well as aggressive behaviors. But when we consider aggressive behaviors in children, the adverse effects of instability is somewhat smaller. And in addition to this, when we consider the single-parent family unit, when a social father enters the household, it does not tend to provide any adverse effects for these outcomes. Now, there's one caveat to these results that we must address, and that is the issue of selection. There are unfavorable circumstances that are typically unobserved that may influence both the family and child well-being. Now, an example of this would be unobserved family and preferences. So, for instance, parents' commitment to and preference for family life could certainly affect the decision to get married or even to keep a family stable. But it's important to understand that these same values and preferences may influence child well-being and development directly. Now, this problem, which is called selection bias, may actually overstate the family structure instability effects that we've just seen. So how do we deal with this problem? Well, we can adjust for selection bias by counting or including in our analyses several demographic and individual characteristics, sort of to help control for these unobserved factors. But as it turns out, the conclusions remain the same in general. For children born to married parents, if their parents divorce, they're more likely to be obese. Those children born to cohabiting parents, they have lower test scores, they display more aggressive behaviors. And if there is a family breakdown in this particular family unit, this actually exacerbates the aggressiveness problem even more. And finally, when we look at children born to single mothers, those children tend to be more obese as well as display more aggressive behaviors compared to their counterparts in married families. But stability is not as important once we adjust for selection. So now that we understand how family structure and stability influence child well-being, we also need to understand the pathways through which the structure and stability of the family unit may influence these same outcomes. Now, in terms of what the literature has done, there are some main mechanisms or pathways at work here. These include parental income, parental emotional well-being, parenting quality, as well as father involvement. So let's start with income. So basically, when a family dissolves, this not only creates instability, but actually reduces or potentially may reduce the income available to children. The loss of income would certainly account for some of the adverse consequences we observe, especially in the single mother family. Another important pathway is that of parents' emotional well-being. So for single parents as well as parents who have experienced family breakdown, this may directly affect their mental health, such as anxiety or depression, which will undoubtedly influence the quality and quantity of time the parents can spend with children, which will ultimately affect their cognitive health and socio-emotional development. Parenting quality is a very similar pathway. Single parents and parents who've experienced some sort of family breakdown also tend to have more mental and emotional health issues. And this will directly affect the quality of parenting that children will receive, and this will ultimately affect their well-being. And finally, we must consider father involvement as an important pathway. Now, when the family breaks down, parents split up, certainly the father's involvement may be affected. A father's involvement is much easier if a father is living in the same household with his child. But it's important to understand that if the fathers can remain actively involved in child's upbringing despite this family breakdown, this could actually help to improve all these different developmental outcomes, whether it be cognition, health, or socio-emotional development. Now, these mechanisms here, income, parents' emotional well-being, parenting quality, father involvement, it's important to understand that these mechanisms are inextricably linked to each other. But the literature tends to cite the importance of income as a mediator between family and child well-being. But when parents split up, it's important to try to preserve the income that children would have had available to them had the parents stayed together. So as a result of this, one important policy response to family breakdown is child support. Now, when parents split up, this puts children potentially at risk for poverty, especially if parents are unmarried and low income. Child support contributions from the non-resident parent, typically the father, are critical to help keep children from falling into depraved conditions. It's important to highlight as well that child support and father involvement go hand in hand. Fathers who make child support contributions are also more likely to be involved in their children's lives. Now, while the custodial parent, typically the mother, may receive contributions from the non-resident father, these financial contributions are oftentimes insufficient and even non-existent for many low-income families. In this scenario, the burden of public assistance will fall on the taxpayer. So how do we deal with the problem of child support delinquency? Well, increased child support enforcement expenditures and key reforms to child support enforcement have been implemented. One of the most important reforms, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, also called PERORA, effectively raised child support awards given to families as well as overall collection of child support payments. But it is important to highlight that not all families eligible for these child support awards petition for them. So why is that? Let us explore the advantages and disadvantages of the child support award. So state child support enforcement policies help to ensure that child support payments are made and made on time. Failure to do this may result in the non-resident father's driver's license being revoked, wages and tax refunds being withheld, or ultimately incarceration for unpaid child support. Now, the custodial parent may receive child support even if the couple is not on amicable terms, and this is because of the automated withdrawal of payments, which is established directly through the formal system. If the non-resident father moves to a different state, because of the ease in which payments can be made, the fathers are more effectively tracked and payments collected as well. Nonetheless, there are some disadvantages of the child support award that have been cited. First is that for low-income fathers, it's been reported that these award amounts are typically too high compared to their income. And if a father has children with multiple women, the awards are even higher and a much larger percentage of actually their income. So it's nearly impossible sometimes for them to make consistent payments. In addition, it's been thought that court involvement in this process may interfere with family cohesion. We can think of a scenario in which a non-resident father may make payments, but who cannot make payments may actually stay away from his child because of the rigorous penalties associated with child support delinquency. Now, as a result of these disadvantages, some non-marital couples actually choose to forego the formal child support award and instead set up their own arrangement called the Informal Child Support Arrangement, which is, of course, independent of the courts. This option is mostly for non-marital couples. Divorced parents, the award is usually established as a part of the divorce proceedings. Now, what are some of the advantages of the informal child support arrangement? Well, parents have the autonomy to determine the amount and frequency of payments, and as a result of this, it's thought to be more suitable for non-resident fathers who make sporadic earnings or who have sporadic employment patterns, as well as under-the-table earnings. In addition to this, because parents are directly in charge of the conflict resolution of in regards to this type of child support arrangement, the non-resident father may be less likely to stay away from the child if he cannot make payments. And as a result, this helps to preserve father-child ties. On the other hand, there are disadvantages as well. Some believe that the child support receipts under this particular arrangement would be lower than they would have been had a formal child support award been established. In addition, because of the informal nature of this arrangement, enforcement of the terms are sometimes difficult. Okay, so which child support arrangement will the couple choose? Certainly they have to weigh the benefits and the costs of each type of child support arrangement in order to determine which of the two is better. But it's important to highlight that there are some families who may be constrained or may be directed into one child support arrangement instead of another. For instance, those families who intend to receive welfare benefits. For welfare benefits, families are directed into establishing a formal child support award. In addition, there are some unfortunate circumstances sometimes in which the mother may be doubtful about paternity. Legal paternity must be established in order to get a formal award. So for these families, actually an informal arrangement may be more suitable. So what is the main story from this presentation? We see that there is a marriage advantage associated with child well-being, that for families who are more stable, however, there seems to be more of an advantage compared to those who have experienced some instability. But it's important to highlight that the long-held theory that marriage confers important benefits for child well-being, this is really most of the work of family stability or the stability of that particular family unit. Children who have experienced instability in general tend to have worse cognitive, health, and socio-emotional outcomes in particular. We do understand, or we're now made aware of the pathways through which family may influence child well-being. We see that income, emotional well-being, parenting quality, as well as father involvement are important mediators of the family-child well-being relationship. And given the changing family landscape in the United States, we must also be aware of the changes to child support options for families, the advantages and disadvantages that may ensue for children. So given this evidence that's been presented, some questions are triggered, particularly related to policy. First is that, can we keep families stable somehow? And if not, how do we try to mitigate the adverse effects that they experience? What sort of programs can be implemented to mitigate these adverse effects? When we look at the formal child support system, certainly it has been effective in collecting child support on behalf of children, particularly non-marital children. But are improvements necessary for this system? And what are some of the suitable reforms that can be made? I am very happy to take your questions related to any of these issues, and thank you very much for attending this webinar.
Thank you very much, Terry Ann. And we have a roster of questions here. I think some people would like you to go back to the 3 charts that you showed on instability with the PPVT, obesity, and aggressiveness, so that they could look at them as we have our discussion. And then once we're back there, we'll...
Okay, here we go.
There we go. So there's one, and we'll just let people look at there. Do you want to go over that briefly again?
Right, so here we're looking at family structure at the time of birth, and we can classify them as stable or unstable. The dark blue bars indicate stability or stable household, stable families, so stable marital family, stable cohabiting, and stable single. The lighter blue would be the unstable family structures at the time of birth. Basically what we're seeing here is that children in the stable marital family, they have the highest scores compared to everybody else, and even compared to their counterparts who were born to married parents but experienced divorce. So we see that there's an 8-point advantage when we compare children who are in stable marital families compared to those who have experienced divorce, and at least a 10 or 11-point advantage when we even look at those children born to cohabiting and single-parent families, whether or regardless whether these families are stable or unstable.
Thank you. One question was whether the results are different when other measures of cognitive health or socio-emotional development are used.
So in one of my studies with Jeannie Brooks-Gunn and Jane Wildfogel, we did look at other measures of cognitive health and socio-emotional development. We looked at, for cognition, we looked at the Woodcock-Johnson test. For health, we looked at asthma in 5-year-old children. And for socio-emotional development, we also looked at anxiety and depression. And yes, actually, we do see these sorts of disparities in the same way as we've seen right now.
Thank you. And another question is that you focused in this work on outcomes for 5-year-old children. What do we know about the family structure and stability effects for adolescents?
Very good question. Yes, family instability does yield adverse effects for adolescents as well. There are certain studies that have shown that adolescents who experience divorce or family breakdown, they actually are more likely to do drugs, experience teen pregnancy, more involved in alcohol, as well as more likely to drop out of high school. So yes, there are adverse consequences related to family instability for adolescents as well.
Now, a couple of questions about managing the damage is one approach, but what about prevention, reducing non-marital childbearing, teen childbearing?
So prevention, well, there are certain policies that have been given for that. Contraception, access and education about teen pregnancies would help, but I think the solutions are many times structural. I think the few job opportunities that are available to these youngsters certainly would help to encourage them to potentially engage in non-marital childbearing before the time. So I think increasing job opportunities or increasing earnings available to that demographic could help to lower non-marital childbearing in my view, and potentially cut down on family breakdown and ultimately the negative consequences that children will experience.
Mm-hmm. Another question came in around managing the damage from unstable or single-parent families. and asks about goals regarding reducing divorce or instability.
Wow. I think, again, it's structural. Certainly we could think about different programs to help parenting or healthy marriage initiative programs, things of that nature. But I think when we look at why couples are breaking up, oftentimes it's related to money issues. So certainly if we could address the structural issues, structural conditions related to earnings and employment, and even providing different benefits for maternity leaves and things of that nature, just to keep families that help to keep families, programs and policies to help keep families together, I think that could help to keep the family stable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A question came in around domestic violence, and were you able to look at domestic violence as a pathway?
Wow, that's a deep question. And domestic violence as a pathway, yes, certainly that would have adverse consequences for children. But yeah, the breakdown of the family related to domestic violence and how that would affect kids. Another related issue would be that of child abuse. Certainly we see that when a social father enters the household, oftentimes kids are more likely to be abused as well. So that's an important pathway that we should consider. Other mediators are related to other levels of instability. We could think of health care instability or school mobility, as well as even relationship quality, which of course is related to the domestic violence factor as well. So yes, those are important mechanisms that we ought to consider.
Yeah, looking at the married couples who have become in unstable relationships, the possibility of conflict emerges. Mm-hmm. As a pathway, I guess that's related to domestic violence.
Relationship quality as well. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Another question was whether you examined the number of family structure transitions over the course of the 5 years that the families were followed.
Oh, the number of transitions. Certainly there's more research that needs to be done on that. But in terms of what I know, the turbulence, the word turbulence is thrown out there, meaning like the number of transitions the child has been through. With the number of transitions, we see that the effects tend to be worse. So the more transitions, whether the family breaks down, builds up, breaks down, that actually helps. That becomes increasingly more negative for kids and their cognitive health and socio-emotional outcomes.
Great. Thank you. And there's a related question around the type and the timing of these transitions or these types of instability. Is there evidence around that?
Types and timing, I think in terms of types, when the family breaks down, I think that actually yields more negative consequences for children, as we saw in these particular analyses presented today. We see for the single-parent household, having a social father may actually help to improve some of the outcomes, even though it's not, the improvement is very slight. But in terms of the adverse effects, it's when the family breaks down. So it's when one parent leaves. We see that lowers test scores, potentially increases obesity, as well as aggressiveness in kids. That's the types. Duration, we don't know much about that. And I think there's more research that needs to be done.
According to the way I read it, one person writes, a child is better off in a family with an unstable married relationship than in a stable single-parent household. Is that accurate in this study? Or would that relate to PPVT or aggressiveness or obesity?
No, it depends on the measure, right? Because, I mean, for the PPVT score, we see that, yes, the cognitive measures may be better if the child is born to married parents, but not for for those children born to single parents. But when we look at obesity, it's a child experiencing divorce it's astronomical. There are 26% of kids experiencing divorce that are obese, and we're seeing that even born to the single parent, whether it's single stable or unstable, single parent unstable or stable families, the incidence is much lower. So I think it depends on the outcome.
And the question asks, what is known about helping couples effectively build stable families?
What is known? I think there's several programs on parenting and keeping families together. I think potentially a part of the Healthy Marriage Initiative that have been implemented. I suspect that the results or the evidence shows that they have been effective somewhat, but certainly there's more that can be done on more of a national scale. But I think, yes, they can be effective in trying to keep cohabiting families stable.
And certainly there are some parenting programs that have been effective, harder with the couples. A question about fathers. How can we keep fathers engaged with non-resident children when they form new relationships and have children with a new partner?
Yeah, so that's a good question, but no easy answers there. I think it's difficult to legislate father involvement. You know, you can't say, while you can mandate visitation as a part of the child support order, it's hard to legislate, okay, you have to be involved. But I think parenting programs could be helpful. I think more important would be education during the teenage years helping young kids understand the consequences and responsibilities associated with having children. I think that could potentially continue to help to reduce teen pregnancy and non-marital childbearing, because now they sort of get an understanding about what fatherhood or what the responsibilities related to fatherhood are involved. And potentially, even if they become fathers out of wedlock or non-maritally, that could help them become better fathers, I think.
Okay. Relatedly, are there statistics regarding how many informal child support agreements exist and if they are successful?
Statistics, very good question. Based on the literature, I think that particularly from the fragile families, there is a substantial percentage of unwed families that actually have informal arrangements, especially during the early years of the child's life. I think they have been effective in transferring finances from the non-resident father to the child. What we know is that the receipts are not as high, but I think certainly the kids do get money through this particular arrangement, and in some cases as well, as stated in this presentation, it could provide more advantages for certain families, especially when the father, his employment patterns are sporadic, or he may be out of work sometimes and in work sometimes. And especially if he's doing jobs that are under the table. So mothers really prefer to have this particular arrangement in the informals under these sorts of circumstances. And yes, it has been effective in collecting child support for kids. What was the second part of that question? I apologize. So you said if it's effective in getting...
Yes, engage with non-resident children when the fathers, form new relationships and have children with a new partner.
Okay, so when they have children with a new partner, certainly the contributions tend to decline. I don't know, and there's not enough work or research done on how to actually help us improve that. I think the next best option would be to set up a formal award or a formal order if possible. So that would certainly keep the child support contributions going. The research has shown that once a father has moved on, set up a new family, sometimes he swaps families. So he's sort of not as involved in the previous families with his previous children as before. So I think the next best thing would be to set up a formal arrangement.
Mm-hmm. So here's another study about a different category of fathers. Are there any studies on married couples and fathers who are absent for work, for example, on military deployment?
There are studies on that, and I suspect that a father's absence will have negative consequences for children. Fathers are important in the household. But I think in terms of the adverse effects, they are certainly not to the same extent as when there is some sort of breakdown in the family. So for military work, yes, the consequences are negative, but not to the same extent as what we have observed today.
Mm-hmm. One comment is we need to focus on the results when selection bias is controlled. This chart is misleading, and the concern there being, I believe, that their selection bias is not controlled for in that chart. Could you just comment on that generally?
What chart? I apologize.
I'm sorry. I guess we are all looking at the obesity chart, but I believe the writer is speaking of the PPVT, obesity and aggressiveness.
Right. So these are bivariate regressions. But as I stated, when we adjust for selection bias, and there are several controls that I use, and this is not a perfect way of dealing with selection bias, I must admit to that. But even after several studies have done several different sorts of methods for dealing with selection bias, we do find that instability and structure, the effects remain. So yes, these are misleading, but I did say that many of the conclusions remain the same once we try to address the selection bias problem.
A good follow-up question has come in. What are some next steps and follow-up research that you'd like to do in this area?
And that's a good question. In terms of what I would like to see more of is the timing of family instability, how that may affect, how does that affect various outcomes? So, for instance, does family instability occurring in the earlier years of the child's life versus adolescence? I mean, are the outcomes different? The duration in a particular family structure, how would that affect outcomes? I'd also like to know if the instability that occurs during childhood, how that it may affect various adult outcomes. So do we see that the adverse effects of instability or growing up in a unwed or non-marital family, do these effects persist into adulthood, and to what extent? And also, I think something that we need to understand is whether child support in the formal arrangement or under the formal regime, does that confer different benefits compared to those children or the outcomes under the informal child support arrangement. So certainly we know that there are advantages and disadvantages associated with each of these arrangements, but I think formally I'd like to compare what the benefits are under these two arrangements.
One person wonders whether the charts change in a same-sex household.
That's a good question, and we don't know enough about that. We really don't know enough about that at all. But that is a good question, and certainly more research needs to be done in that area.
Another question is about gender differences, whether boys or girls are affected differently.
That's a good question as well. Actually, in terms of the effects of instability and structure, what I know is that there may be a slight difference, but the difference between boys and girls is not significant at all.
And in terms of policies, one person asks whether any policies, in your opinion, have backfired.
That's a thorny issue. I think policies for a while there were lots of studies that came out looking at whether welfare may have helped to induce non-marital childbearing and may have some responsibility for what we observe in terms of family breakdown. The results on that are very mixed and very controversial. So there are some parties that say yes, welfare may have helped to induce non-marital childbearing. Some find no evidence of this, and that's the extent to which I'll comment on that. I don't have a particular opinion either way.
What about two-generational approaches? Are there two-generational approaches that would be helpful mitigating these effects?
Yes, yes, yes. So there are parent-child and child-parenting approaches that could be effective in dealing with some of the negative consequences associated with family breakdown, absolutely.
And with regard to ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, this measure of difficult experiences in children's lives, this questioner asks, how do adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, interrelate with unstable families and child outcomes?
I need to repeat that question, please.
It's around how do adverse childhood experiences interrelate with unstable families and child outcomes, and adverse childhood experiences being measures of highly traumatic, difficult experiences in the child's life. And many of the measures, I believe, include family breakup.
Right. So there are other types. I think if it refers to other types of family instability, is that? Right. So there are several types of family instability we could point to. We could point to employment instability, healthcare instability, school mobility, as well as residential instability. And yes, these are all interconnected.
Incarceration is often included,
Incarceration
and
as well,
use,
right?
so
They're certainly
violence.
all interconnected. And the question that emerges from that is like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? So we know that they're inextricably linked, but the research is sparse as to which of these causes the others, or which is the foremost one. I would say it's more income instability. That's the foremost, but I'm sure that there are other researchers who may disagree with me. But in terms of what I've seen, I think that is the one that spurs the rest, or typically spurs the rest.
And the teen birth rate, of course, has fallen dramatically. The question is, has this helped, or will this help?
So if we look at non-marital fertility over time, we see that it's actually flatlined a bit since the turn of the century. We know that teen fertility has declined, so this has helped to flatline non-marital fertility. But I don't think it's going away. I think what's happening is that people are actually just delaying non-marital fertility rather than foregoing fertility altogether, or even having more children in the context of marriage. So it has helped to actually slow the growth of non-marital fertility, but it has flatlined nonetheless, which indicates that they're just delaying fertility altogether.
Here's a big question. What are the major characteristics of quality parenting?
Major characteristics of quality parenting.
I'm assuming that this question is referring to the pathway of parenting quality, and what is it you have in mind, or how is that measured?
Parenting quality, I think, in terms of how it's been measured, is the time spent with the child and how that time has been spent. So the characteristics would be the sort of activities that parents are engaging with, the sorts of activities parents and children are engaging with. So certainly potentially reading together, playing together, and eating together, but eating nutritious foods could be a part of it. But I'm sure there are several characteristics of parenting, and I'm not as familiar with that literature. I do know that the sorts of activities that parents engage in with their child could determine the quality of the time they're spending together, and that determines quality parenting. I know that certain abuse measures, such as spanking, could be related to negative aspects of parenting, but there are certainly several aspects we could point to, and not as familiar with this literature, I must admit, as well.
Okay. None of us can know everything. But here is a question about children or people being diagnosed with autism and other disabilities. And what do you think? There could be a change in legislation to increase the length of time non-custodial parents can pay child support for children with special needs.
Wow, that's a good question. That is a good question, but we don't know. We don't. Do we have the research? Do we have the research knowledge to support that sort of policy recommendation? That's something we cannot yet address unless we've done some of the research on this a little bit more. I can't address it at this point, but that is certainly a very good question to ask.
Yeah, the writer notes that having a child with special needs increases separation and divorces. So research on that would certainly be useful.
Yes, that certainly would make sense. That would certainly make sense, but that's something more research needs to be done on in order to determine whether child support beyond age 18 would be necessary.
An interesting question. How does the speaker square her opinion that income primarily matters with the outcomes described by Judith Wallerstein on the impact of family instability on high-income families' children?
Well, family instability within the high-income cohort or the high-income population. So when a parent moves out, that would certainly lead to a drop-off in income, or the income available in the household for the child, right? based on what I know of the literature, particularly for the low-income population, I'm not familiar with that work that's been cited. But in terms of the low-income population, we know that family breakdown is directly associated with a drop-off in income that's available to the child. So I think that is one of the primary mediators between family breakdown and child well-being, according to what I know of. But certainly not as familiar with that work for high income, within the high income population that's just been cited.
My guess is that the writer is trying to get at the distinction between poverty, the decline in income that makes you truly poor, versus a drop in income that makes you less affluent than you used to be.
Yes, certainly the drop, regardless if it's a drop-off in income or poverty, that's directly associated with how children are going to fare. It's going to affect their cognitive development. Can we buy books for the child? Can we have children engage or pay for extracurricular activities, as well as health measures? Can we afford to send the child to the doctor when the child is sick? Of course, other health-related issues, as well as socio-emotional development. I believe, based on what I've done and what I've read in the literature, that income is the main one, even though that there are other mechanisms that are interrelated or inextricably linked to that. But income is the main drop-off, and I think that directly affects various child outcomes.
Returning to the important issue of selection bias, writer asks, in particular, what factors did you use to control for selection bias? In particular, were you able to address non-cognitive differences between family structures, such as self-efficacy?
Yes. Let me run down the list of what I was able to control for. We controlled for parents, age, race, education. We used a measure of ability for parents. We used the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Score. We used a measure for their impulsivity. I think it's called the Dickman's Dysfunctional Impulsivity Index. We controlled for their mental health problems. We controlled for family background factors as well. We controlled for whether the parents had a father figure at age 15. We also controlled for the years in which parents knew each other before the mother became pregnant with the child.
Great. A long list. Okay. We have time perhaps for one more question, and I see several people are typing. While we are waiting for those to appear, let me tell everyone that we have our next speaker set. Anna Gaspin-Pines will be speaking on the implications of statewide job losses on child well-being. That we have these quarterly, so that will be in early March, and promises to also be a very interesting presentation. Question: Are there any strengths associated with more complex families? By complex, I assume multiple partner fertility, step families.
Wow, that is a very controversial issue. That I could point to one theory about children being classified as either dandelions or orchids. The orchids tend to, who are more, they tend to be more reactive to changes in family structure or any sort of turbulence that may have occurred in the family. But dandelions tend to, they try to just, what's the word I'm looking for? They're able to overcome them. So I think in many instances, dandelion kids, who are just strong, are able to overcome these sorts of instability or turbulent circumstances within the household. They tend to reach very high heights in terms
Thank
of
you very much. We are now at 3 o'clock, and I want to thank everyone who joined us and for the many interesting and stimulating questions that they asked. And thank you, Terry and Craigie.
Thank you.
That concludes today's conference. We thank you for your participation.